Most people think power feels loud. It does not. In my world, power is quiet. It moves through rooms without being announced. It does not need to raise its voice. It sits at the head of the table and waits. That is how I built my life. For 20 years, I turned chaos into structure. I did not inherit this position. I calculated my way into it. Every alliance was measured. Every decision was deliberate. I never believed in rage. Rage makes mistakes. I believed in systems. My name carries weight in places most people will never see. Contracts are signed because I allow them to be signed. Debts are settled because I decide they are settled. I do not involve myself in unnecessary cruelty. Disorder is expensive. Fear, when used carefully, is efficient. My inner circle has been with me for years. Adrian, my advisor, handles negotiations. He speaks softly, listens carefully, and rarely contradicts me in public. Marcus, my accountant, tracks every movement of money with surgical precision. He prides himself on clean records. Daniel, head of security, ensures that no one enters a room unless I know their name first. Trust, for me, is not emotional. It is structural. If the numbers align and the outcomes remain stable, I consider the system intact. Under my organization, several community rehabilitation programs operate across the city: orphanages, youth shelters, adoption assistance centers. They exist on paper as proof that we give back. It is useful. It softens perception. It stabilizes certain political relationships. I never visited them. That was not negligence in my mind. It was delegation. I funded them. I reviewed summaries. I signed off on expansions. Marcus assured me audits were clean. Adrian confirmed public reports reflected positive impact. There were photographs sometimes. Smiling children. Renovated buildings. Staff standing in neat rows. I would glance at them between meetings, nod once, and move on to matters that required sharper attention. I believed in efficiency. If something required my personal intervention, it would reach my desk clearly and urgently. That was the understanding within my circle, and nothing urgent ever did. My days followed a rhythm: morning briefings, afternoon negotiations, evening strategy reviews. Silence was common in my office, not because people were afraid to speak, but because they understood words were currency. Waste none. I did not think of children. I did not think of families. Those were distractions that complicated judgment. Control was simpler. Looking back now, what unsettles me most is not that something was wrong. It is that everything looked right. The reports were polished. The numbers were balanced. The loyalty seemed steady. No raised voices. No obvious cracks. If there were warning signs, they were subtle enough to blend into routine. I trusted the structure because I built it. I trusted the men because they had never given me a reason not to. And I trusted myself because I believed I would notice if something beneath my name was rotting. I was wrong. But at the time, my world felt ordered, stable, efficient, untouchable. The day she walked into my office began like any other: morning reports, controlled voices, numbers discussed without emotion. Adrian stood near the window, reviewing a development contract. Marcus was seated across from me with a ledger open, explaining minor reallocations within the rehabilitation budget. Daniel remained near the door, still and observant. Nothing unusual. Then the door opened without announcement. Daniel does not make mistakes like that. He stepped inside first, but he was not alone. The girl walked in behind him. She was small, dark hair tied unevenly, as if done in a hurry. Her shoes were too thin for the weather. She did not look frightened. That was the first thing I noticed. Children usually look overwhelmed in my presence. She did not. She looked focused. Adrian reacted first. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, already moving toward her. "She's from one of the youth facilities. There was confusion during a scheduled visit." The girl did not look at him. She looked at me. Daniel's posture was rigid but not protective, defensive. No one had explained why she was here. "Do you know anyone who wants a child?" she asked. Her voice was steady, not loud, not trembling. The room shifted in a way I could not define. Marcus closed his ledger slowly. Adrian forced a thin smile, the kind meant to dissolve tension before it forms. "She's confused," Adrian repeated. "There's been a lot of adjustment at her facility, transfers, new placements. She misunderstood a conversation." The girl did not repeat herself. She simply waited. I studied her face. There was no performance in it, no visible attempt to gain sympathy. If anything, she looked impatient. "Who brought her here?" I asked. Daniel answered carefully. "She left the group tour and followed the hallway. By the time security intercepted her, she was already outside your door." Group tour. I was not informed of any scheduled tour. Adrian spoke again, slightly faster this time. These visits are routine, community transparency. It was approved last quarter. Moved perhaps, but not mentioned this morning. The girl's hands were clenched at her sides, not in fear, in restraint. Why are you asking me that? I asked her. She hesitated, but only briefly. They said I'm going somewhere soon, she replied. Somewhere that needs children. The phrasing was wrong. Children are not items to be needed. Adrian stepped forward. That's enough. She overheard adult logistics. She doesn't understand context. I felt something small but unfamiliar move through me. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to irritation, not at her, at the tone being used to dismiss her. Take her back, I said finally. Daniel nodded. Adrian placed a guiding hand on her shoulder. She did not resist, but before she turned away, she looked at me again, not pleading, measuring. After the door closed, the silence felt heavier than before. Marcus cleared his throat. Children misinterpret administrative language all the time. Administrative language, I nodded once. The meeting resumed, but the rhythm was gone. And for the first time in years, something under my name did not feel entirely structured. I did not confront anyone immediately. Confrontation reveals intention too early. Instead, I requested documents. Quietly. Later that evening, after most of the building had emptied, I asked Marcus to send me the full financial breakdown of the rehabilitation programs from the past 18 months. Not summaries, not quarterly reports, raw entries. He paused, only for a second, then he nodded. Of course. By midnight, the files were in my inbox. At first glance, everything appeared orderly. Allocations matched expenses. Renovations were itemized. Staff salaries were consistent. Adoption processing fees were logged cleanly. Too cleanly. Large systems breathe. They fluctuate. They make small mistakes. This one did not. I began with transfers between facilities. Children moved from one orphanage to another under the classification placement optimization. The phrasing was neutral, professional, but the frequency was unusual. Several names appeared more than once within short periods. Relocated, reprocessed, reassigned. I cross-referenced dates. Some transfers were approved before intake evaluations were completed. That should not happen. The signatures authorizing them were digital, verified. Marcus's office. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. One irregularity is noise. A pattern is signal. The next morning, I requested attendance logs and staffing reports from the same facilities. High turnover among caregivers, short employment periods. Several resigned without exit documentation. When I asked Adrian about it, he smiled in the same careful way he had in my office. These environments are emotionally demanding, he said. Burnout is common. Background checks, I asked. Standard procedure, he replied smoothly. All compliant. He did not ask why I was reviewing it personally. That was new. Daniel approached me later in private. With respect, he said, digging into charitable fronts draws attention. If there's nothing wrong, it still creates movement. Movement from who? I asked. He held my gaze for a moment too long. From people who monitor patterns. It sounded like concern. It felt like caution. That evening, I returned to the transfer logs. I selected 3 names at random and requested physical files, not digital copies. 2 files arrived within the hour. The third did not. When I followed up, I was told it had been archived off-site for storage restructuring. Archived. The girl's words returned to me. Somewhere that needs children. The phrasing no longer sounded like confusion. It sounded repeated. I reviewed the digital authorization timestamps again. Several were approved late at night, outside normal administrative hours. Marcus does not work late without informing me. I did not accuse him, not yet. Instead, I asked for a full list of external partner organizations receiving transferred placements. The list was shorter than expected, too short for the volume of movement recorded. For the first time in years, I felt something I had trained myself to suppress. Doubt, not in the system, in the men managing it. And doubt, in my position, is never small. I decided to stop observing quietly. Patterns demand pressure. The next morning, I called Adrian and Marcus into my office together. Daniel remained outside the door. I did not want this conversation overheard, but I also did not want it witnessed. I placed 3 printed transfer logs on the desk between us. Explain these, I said. Marcus adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages with practiced calm. Adrian remained standing, hands folded in front of him. They're standard redistribution cases, Marcus replied. Capacity balancing. One facility exceeds occupancy limits, another has availability. Then why were 2 approved before intake reviews were completed? Marcus did not hesitate. Pre-approval to prevent delay. The evaluations follow within 48 hours. They did not, I said. Adrian stepped in smoothly. There are administrative gaps in every large system. You know that better than anyone. His tone was careful, not defensive, not aggressive, calm enough to imply I was overreacting. I watched their faces closely. No visible fear, only irritation. You're questioning procedure, Adrian continued. Procedure you approved. That was deliberate. Shift the focus. Make it about my oversight. Marcus added, if we begin scrutinizing every minor inconsistency, we create instability. Staff feel distrusted. Partners feel audited. Should they? I asked. Silence followed, not tense, measured. Adrian leaned forward slightly. With respect, you have larger priorities. These facilities are optics, community anchors. They function. Function how? They produce positive outcomes, Marcus said quickly. Placement rates are strong, financial audits are clean. The word clean again, overused. I slid the missing file request form across the desk. Why was this archived off-site without replacement documentation? Marcus glanced at it briefly. Clerical backlog. Adrian sighed, almost sympathetically. You're letting one child's misunderstanding distort your perception. There it was, the girl reduced to a misunderstanding. She asked a question, I said. A confused question, Adrian corrected gently. Children imagine things, especially when they overhear adult planning. I felt the shift more clearly now, not in volume, in positioning. They were not answering to me, they were managing me. Daniel knocked lightly and stepped inside without being called. Everything all right? He asked. It was subtle, but his eyes moved first to Adrian, not me. Yes, Adrian replied before I could speak. We're clarifying reporting standards. Reporting standards, I dismissed them without another word. After they left, the office felt unfamiliar. I had built my authority on control, but control requires access to truth. Information was now arriving filtered, responses rehearsed, concern redirected back toward me. The implication was clear. I was distracted, sentimental, overreaching. The more I questioned, the more they framed my scrutiny as instability. For years, I had been the calm center of every decision. Now I felt something tightening around the edges, not open defiance, something quieter, isolation. And for the first time, I understood that power can erode without noise. It simply begins answering itself. The message arrived through a channel that had not been used in years. A private number. No identification. Only a location and a time. I considered ignoring it. Instead, I went alone. The cafe was nearly empty. Late afternoon, rain against the windows. She was seated in the far corner, posture rigid, hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. I worked at the East District facility, she said before I asked her name. Her voice carried the strain of someone who had rehearsed this conversation repeatedly. I resigned 3 months ago. Why contact me now? I asked. She slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were copies, not originals. Transfer authorizations, internal memos, handwritten notes. I recognized Marcus's digital approval signature on several documents, but the receiving organizations were not adoption agencies. They were shell companies, logistics firms, agricultural contractors, private labor brokers. The children aren't being adopted, she said quietly. They're being relocated for apprenticeship programs. That's the language they use. I read the memos carefully. Placement optimization. Vocational integration. External sponsorship pipeline. Clean words, ugly meaning. Why didn't you report this to authorities? I asked, her jaw tightened. I did, twice. The files were redirected, closed for insufficient evidence. Of course they were. My name was attached to those facilities. My influence insulated them. She pointed to one highlighted entry. The girl who came to you, her name is listed here, scheduled for transfer next month. Transfer to one of the shell entities. She overheard a staff member discussing her processing date, the woman continued. That's why she asked you that question. She thought she was being sent somewhere permanent, somewhere that needed children. Needed, the word settled heavily. Why are you giving this to me? I asked. Because this doesn't happen without protection, she said, and the only protection big enough is yours. It was not an accusation shouted in anger. It was stated as fact. I closed the folder slowly. The evidence was incomplete. Copies can be fabricated, names can be manipulated, but the patterns aligned too precisely with what I had already seen. Repeated transfers, late-night approvals, archived files, and the resistance when I questioned it. If this is true, I said, it has operated beneath my authority. She held my gaze. It operates because of your authority. There was no triumph in her voice, only exhaustion. When I left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The city looked the same as it always had, orderly, structured, untouched. But I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. If this network existed, it did not hide from me. It hid behind me. And the child who stood in my office had not been confused. She had been trying to escape. I did not confront them directly, not after what I read. Instead, I changed small things: access permissions, audit protocols, communication channels. Quiet adjustments that would go unnoticed, unless someone was watching closely. Within 48 hours, someone reacted. 2 of the shell company records were suddenly flagged as inactive partnerships. Archived, cleaned from active routing lists. The missing child file I had requested earlier was restored to the database, complete with updated intake notes that had not existed before. They were correcting history, not because I had accused them, because they sensed pressure. I called Marcus into my office alone. Why were 2 external partnerships dissolved this week? I asked calmly. He did not look surprised. Strategic realignment, he replied. Low efficiency, we decided to discontinue. He hesitated. Adrian recommended it, I approved. Without my input. I want full disclosure on all discontinued entities, I said. Of course, he answered quickly, too quickly. Later that afternoon, Daniel approached me. There's been unusual movement, he said. Someone accessed high-level archival data late last night. Who? He met my eyes steadily. Your credentials. I felt the shift settle in my chest. I did not authorize that. He nodded slowly. Then someone is attempting to provoke internal distrust. Provoke, frame, redirect. The language was becoming predictable. That evening, I contacted the former employee. No answer. Her number was disconnected. I drove past the address she had written inside the folder. The apartment was vacant. Neighbors claimed she had moved suddenly. No forwarding information. Too sudden. Back at my office, I reviewed security footage logs, gaps, small windows of corrupted data during the hours I had adjusted access controls. Someone inside my own infrastructure was protecting the operation, not defensively, strategically. The following morning, Adrian requested a private meeting. You're creating instability, he said without preamble. Partners are nervous, staff morale is declining, there are rumors you suspect internal misconduct. Should I not? I asked. His expression remained composed. If you continue down this path publicly, it attracts attention we cannot contain. Attention from who? I asked again. This time he did not answer. Instead, he said, sometimes ignorance is structural, it protects everyone. Everyone, except the children. I realized then that this was not opportunistic corruption. It was organized, layered, protected at multiple levels, and my silence over the years had provided perfect cover. By the end of that week, law enforcement inquiries began circling one of the discontinued shell companies. Subtle requests for documentation, routine checks. Someone had spoken, or someone had been careless. Either way, pressure was no longer internal. It was expanding outward. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. The system I built to eliminate vulnerability had become one. Not because it was weak, because it trusted the wrong men. I did not cry. Not yet. I sat alone in the same office where I had built my reputation. The walls, the polished wood, the heavy leather chair, everything familiar, suddenly felt like a cage. I traced the edge of my desk with my fingers, counting the scratches I had never noticed before. The scratches seemed insignificant once. Now they reminded me of the countless small oversights that had stacked into something unbearable. The girl's question returned. Clear, simple, devastating. Do you know anyone who wants a child? I realized then that my life had always been measured in systems, not souls. In efficiency, not empathy. In control, not care. And somewhere within that structure, children had been treated as numbers, as assets, as objects to be processed. The girl had seen that truth, unfiltered, while I had ignored it for years. I called the former employee's folder back to my mind. The transfers, the approvals, the shell organizations. Every piece of evidence aligned with what I had already suspected but had resisted believing fully. I had wanted doubt to protect me, to preserve my authority. But now the doubt was gone, replaced by something heavier, responsibility. I walked to the window. Rain had started again, thin and cold. The city outside moved as if nothing had changed. Streetlights glimmered on wet asphalt. Cars passed, indifferent. People lived their lives unaware of what had been done under my name. The weight of the truth pressed into me quietly. It was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no shouting, no immediate catastrophe. Just the slow, relentless realization that my authority had been used to shield cruelty. That my silence, my trust in the wrong people, had been a crime of omission. I thought about the girl, about how calm she had been when she asked me the question. Her courage struck me, a stark contrast to my own paralysis. She had understood more than I had. She had named the problem simply, and yet my world had been unable to contain it. I considered my inner circle. Adrian, Marcus, Daniel, each had operated under my name but outside my control. Their betrayal was meticulous, strategic, cold, and yet the hardest betrayal was my own, my refusal to look closely. My belief that control alone was enough. For the first time, I felt entirely powerless, not in the physical sense, not in the way that others feared me, but powerless in the only way that truly matters, powerless to undo what had already happened, powerless to protect those who could not protect themselves, powerless to reclaim innocence that had been lost on my watch. I sat at my desk, silent, counting the minutes, listening to the faint hum of the city. The files, the evidence, the reports all lay before me. I understood that action was necessary, but action would not erase the past. It could only prevent continuation. And in that quiet, heavy realization, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in decades: shame. I did not make a scene. There would be no grand confrontation, no speeches, no displays of power. Consequences, I realized, were quiet. They moved like water, slow but inevitable, reshaping everything in their path. I began with my inner circle. Adrian's office was empty when I arrived, as if he had sensed the shift before I acted. Marcus was in accounting, pretending to work, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Daniel stood near the door, neutral, but I could see the calculations behind his eyes, how far he could push before the damage became irreversible. Files were secured. All external partnerships were placed under independent oversight. Transfers paused. Financial accounts frozen where they intersected with questionable organizations. Every record reviewed. Every authorization double-checked. Adrian did not return. Marcus faced repeated questioning, subtle yet thorough, by auditors I had quietly engaged. He offered explanations, but the cracks were evident. Some files were missing. Some memos could not be verified. The structures that had protected misconduct were crumbling under scrutiny, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Daniel, who had enforced loyalty through intimidation, now faced the reality that obedience to his direction had no shield from consequence. Staff members who had been complicit, whether actively or passively, were quietly removed. Positions restructured. Accountability was no longer abstract. It had teeth. I did not wait for applause. There was none. These measures were not for show. They were for the children, for the truth, and for the understanding that my silence had contributed to the system that allowed harm to exist. I requested updates daily. Reports trickled in slowly. Former employees being protected, children relocated to verified, secure facilities, shell companies investigated by authorities. Each update was a small acknowledgement that the web of deception was being dismantled. No one celebrated. There was no victory, only rectification. I sat in my office for hours, reviewing the evidence I had gathered myself. Each file, each transfer, each manipulated signature reminded me of what had been allowed to persist. And yet, I realized that dismantling the structures was only part of the consequence. The human cost, the lives affected, the fear instilled, the innocence lost was permanent. That could not be corrected, only contained. For the first time, I understood the true weight of oversight and negligence. Power without attention is a weapon in someone else's hands. Authority is only as moral as the vigilance that accompanies it. By the end of the week, the offices were quieter. Operations had slowed, but truth had emerged. I had acted. Consequences had fallen. Those responsible were facing inquiry or removal, but no one would ever speak of the process openly. My world required discretion, even when enforcing accountability. And yet, in the silence of my office, I felt the echo of the girl's question, the one that had started this chain of reckoning. It haunted me not because I had acted too late, but because the system I trusted had been allowed to harm the vulnerable while I observed from a distance. The city continued its rhythm outside, oblivious to the quiet corrections made within these walls. No headlines would announce the dismantling of deception. No one would know the scope of what had been hidden in plain sight. Only I understood. Only I carried the weight. The office was empty. The hum of the city outside filtered through the glass windows. Rain had begun again, steady and thin, blurring the lights of the streets below. I sat at my desk, not reviewing files, not issuing instructions, just sitting. The silence felt heavier than any conversation, any confrontation, any threat I had ever faced. The empire remained, though smaller, cleaner, safer. Not because of any dramatic intervention, but because truth had surfaced and consequences had quietly done their work. Those responsible were no longer in positions of influence. The systems that had allowed harm were now under scrutiny beyond my control. The machinery of deception had been dismantled, one careful step at a time. I thought of the girl, 7 years old, steady in her voice, unwavering in her question. She had seen the truth when no one else would acknowledge it. She had demanded honesty, and the question she asked, simple, direct, had forced change. She had not spoken of revenge or anger or fear. She had simply named reality. There would be no speeches about justice, no public acknowledgement of my role in correcting it, no grand gestures. Action had been taken, and that was enough. The weight of knowing of responsibility was its own truth. That was all there was. I thought of the children who had been relocated to secure facilities, some I would never see. Some would carry memories I could not erase. My responsibility did not end with enforcement. I understood now that authority without attention had allowed harm to exist. I would not allow it again, not quietly, not with oversight, not with structure alone. But understanding did not ease the burden. It only clarified it. I looked at the chair across from my desk, empty. Adrian would not return. Marcus had been removed. Daniel remained only in records, neutral in absence. For years, I had relied on people, systems, and distance to manage risk. Now I relied on neither. I relied on awareness, on presence, on the understanding that silence can be a form of violence. Outside, the city carried on. Cars moved, lights flickered, people laughed and argued in ways that would never touch this room. I envied that simplicity. And yet, I had no choice but to remain aware, to maintain vigilance, to understand that even the smallest oversight could have immense consequences. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. There would be no relief, no sense of victory, no celebration of correction, only quiet acknowledgement of truth. Only the knowledge that a child's voice, small and fearless, had revealed the fractures in my world and forced accountability where none had existed before. And that was enough. The most dangerous man in the room had been speechless once, not from fear, not from loss of control, but from recognition of responsibility. From understanding that power without attention is meaningless, and that silence can cost more than any act of violence. The room remained still. The rain fell. And for the first time in a long time, I did not need to speak. The truth had arrived quietly, and I simply bore witness.